They say love is built on trust. But in my case, love came with a price tag, $800,000. My wife said it was for security, that if anything ever happened to me, she'd be safe. I didn't realize that safety meant my absence. The first time I saw her reading that insurance policy, she didn't look sad. She looked calculating. So when the letters started arriving and the calls stopped being about love, I knew she wasn't planning for our future. She was planning for my end. But here's the thing about insurance. Sometimes the one who writes the policy doesn't realize who's really being covered. When I met Laura, I wasn't rich. I was just a steady man in my early 50s who still believed that calm people could build calm lives. I'd worked for 25 years in a small logistics company, never late, never flashy. Laura called that dependable. I called it survival. We bought our first house together, a weathered colonial with fading paint and a half-grown maple out front. On weekends, we'd sit on the porch and talk about retirement plans, the way people talk about distant lands they're never sure they'll see. She said she wanted security. I said I wanted peace. Somewhere in between those two words, we built a marriage. About a year after we married, she brought up life insurance. "It's just smart," she said, holding a brochure between two fingers like it was a menu. "If anything happened, I'd be taken care of." I signed the papers because that's what you do when someone you love calls it our plan. $800,000, numbers I barely looked at. For a while, life was routine in the best way. I'd leave early, she'd water the plants, and by the time I got home, there'd be music drifting from the kitchen. But something changed that winter. She started closing the laptop when I walked in. The phone that used to ring openly was suddenly face down, silent. She smiled the same, but her eyes stayed somewhere else. One night I asked, "You okay?" "Just tired," she said, rubbing her temples. "You work too much. I worry about you." That should have sounded caring. Instead, it felt rehearsed, like a line she'd said before, just not to me. A month later, I found the first letter. It wasn't hidden, just left on the counter beside an empty coffee cup. It came from the insurance company. Routine policy review, it said. Beneficiary confirmation. Her name printed cleanly beside the figure, $800,000. That night, she suggested a weekend getaway to clear our heads. I agreed. He even smiled, but something in my chest clicked into place. A quiet, humming suspicion. After that, I started noticing details the way you notice background music after someone turns it down. The faint smell of new perfume on her coat, the extra miles on the car, the way she lingered near my side of the closet, not with affection but calculation. Still, I told myself I was imagining it. You don't accuse someone you love of scheming. You tell yourself they're tired, distracted, human. Then, late one Sunday, I came home early from work. The light in her office was on. Through the half-open door, I saw her video chatting with someone, numbers and policy terms filling the screen. I heard my own name and then her voice saying quietly, "It'll happen soon enough." She didn't see me. I backed away, heart thudding so loudly it drowned out the words that followed. That night, while she slept, I sat in the living room and stared at the framed picture of us on our wedding day. I remembered what I'd promised, to provide, to protect. And then I wondered, who was protecting me? I didn't confront her, not yet, because sometimes the best way to learn the truth isn't to ask, it's to watch. The next morning, Laura kissed me on the cheek like always. Her perfume was light, floral, exactly the kind she wore when she wanted to be remembered. I watched her drive away, the taillights fading into the street, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't feel comfort watching her go. I felt distance. At work, I pretended to read emails while my mind replayed her voice from the night before. "It'll happen soon enough." I didn't know what it was, but the way she said it wasn't casual. It was planned, so I started keeping small notes. Times she left, places she said she'd be, numbers from the insurance paperwork I copied quietly before shredding the envelope. The habit felt wrong, but necessary, like locking your doors in a neighborhood that used to be safe. Weeks passed. Her affection grew strangely performative. She cooked dinners she never used to cook, complimented shirts she once hated. When I caught her glancing at my phone bill, she laughed it off. Just making sure you're not working too late. I smiled back because pretending to believe someone is sometimes the only way to stay invisible. One evening, while she was out shopping, I opened her laptop. I expected guilt. I found detail. Folders labeled house plans, budget policy. Inside, spreadsheets, meticulous ones, mapping every possible expense if I were gone. Mortgage paid. Debts cleared. Total balance, $798,450. The precision chilled me more than any confession could have. But then I found something else, an email thread with a financial advisor. Her messages were polite, professional, but one line stood out. He doesn't need to know. It's covered. That night I sat outside on the porch, the same place we used to dream about retirement. The garden lights flickered on, bathing everything in a calm glow that suddenly looked artificial. I remember thinking how fragile peace looks when you know what it costs. I didn't sleep. Instead, I started setting quiet boundaries, moved some funds, changed my direct deposits, made digital copies of every document she might touch. Not revenge, just protection. Then came the car accident, or what she thought was one. A colleague had called to say someone reported my license plate in a highway pileup outside town. It wasn't me. My car had been parked outside my office all morning. When I got home, Laura was pale, shaking, her phone still in her hand. She looked at me like she'd seen a ghost. I thought you were, she stammered, unable to finish. That's when I realized. The story of my disappearance had already been rehearsed in her mind. After that, her behavior changed again. She grew quieter, watchful. I could feel her studying me, the way a chess player studies a piece before sacrificing it. But I didn't react. I smiled. I lived my routines. I waited, because now for the first time I wasn't guessing. I was observing. And what I learned over those next weeks would reshape everything I believed about love, loyalty, and what a man is worth when someone starts counting the dollars instead of the days. I started treating life like a stage play. Every line, every move rehearsed, every silence purposeful. Laura thought she was the only one with a plan, but she forgot who'd been studying her for months. The first step was subtle distance. I stopped arguing. I agreed to everything. You're right. Good idea. I'll leave it to you. Each phrase was a seed of false comfort, and she watered it daily. Her confidence returned. She laughed more, touched my arm at dinner, made weekend plans, the kind that sound like reconciliation but smell like calculation. Meanwhile, I changed things quietly. My insurance policy? Reassigned, not canceled, but redirected to a trust I'd formed months earlier. The beneficiary was still Laura on paper, but the payout wouldn't go to her. It would activate only if certain verification steps were met, steps that required me to confirm in person. I made sure she'd never know that detail. Next, I started leaving little clues, the kind that seemed unintentional. A hospital brochure on the counter, search history showing life expectancy after surgery. She noticed. She pretended not to, but she noticed. I could feel her watching me again, reassessing the timeline in her head. One night she asked softly, "Have you been feeling okay?" I smiled, just tired. "Work's been a lot." She nodded, and there was something almost tender in her eyes. but I'd seen the same look once before. It wasn't love, it was anticipation. Over the next weeks, I played the part of a man fading out of his own story. Missed calls, doctor visits, restless nights on the couch. She began keeping her phone closer, deleting texts faster, stepping outside to check on something. It was working. Then came the call from the insurance company, a courtesy reminder to confirm my beneficiary information. She didn't know I was listening on speaker when the agent left a message. I watched her expression carefully, panic first, then control. "Oh," she said casually. "That's just about updating contact info. I'll handle it." She smiled like she always did when she thought I was a fool. That weekend, she suggested a trip. "Let's get away," she said, "just us. Somewhere peaceful." Her timing was perfect. Too perfect. I agreed instantly. Sure, I could use the air. We drove to the mountains. A rented cabin, quiet roads, and air so thin it made every breath count. She cooked. We laughed. We even danced once. Slow, clumsy, like two ghosts remembering how it used to feel to be alive. But at night, when she thought I was asleep, she made a call outside. I recorded it. Not for the police, not for revenge, but because I needed proof of what I'd always known. Her voice trembled through the phone. "He's here, tomorrow. I'll text you once it's done." I didn't recognize the voice on the other end, but the tone was cold, businesslike. They weren't talking about love. They were talking about closure, financial closure. The next morning, I made coffee just like always. She smiled across the table, the kind of smile people wear when they're already rehearsing grief. And that's when I told her my news. I changed the policy. Her smile froze. "What?" I kept my voice calm, gentle even. "Yeah, the company said it needed a final verification. From me in person. They'll call on Monday. Maybe we can go together?" Her eyes darkened. For a moment, she forgot how to act. Then she nodded too quickly. "Of course, that's fine." That's when I knew the game had flipped. The woman who once studied me like prey was now calculating her next move under pressure. But she didn't know the real twist. The one I'd spent months crafting. Because in the paperwork, there wasn't just a trust. There was also a trigger clause. One that redirected the payout permanently if any suspicious claim or report of my death was filed within 12 months of amendment, meaning if she tried anything at all, the entire $800,000 would go to charity in my name. I didn't tell her that part. I wanted her to live with the illusion that she still had control, because sometimes the cruelest revenge isn't punishment. It's clarity. Watching someone realize that the web they spun around you is now wrapped around themselves. That was the beginning of my quiet revenge. But the real lesson, the one she'd never forget, was still waiting for her back home. When you spend months arranging a quiet correction, the final moment rarely looks like the climax you once imagined. There are no spotlights, no dramatic shouts into the night. Instead, there are phone calls, polite letters, and small faces in courtrooms that never make it onto talk shows. The real work of undoing deception happens in boring offices and under the steady hand of people who don't care about drama. They care about accuracy. The Monday after the mountain trip, my phone rang early. I let it buzz until the second ring and then answered, voice careful. "Mr. Calloway at the insurance company," the agent said. Her voice was efficient, practiced. "We're calling to confirm a change request on your policy." On the line, I heard the echo of the past months. The little moves I'd made, the copies I'd saved, the trust I'd quietly rerouted. I answered every question as though the routine of it were the only thing in the world that mattered. I kept my tone steady. It may have been the strangest thing I'd ever done to play a man who had nothing left to hide. Later that morning, Laura stood in our kitchen like a woman waiting on a verdict. Her hands were folded, the skin at her knuckles pale. The house felt smaller, the light thinner. She kept glancing at the cordless phone on the counter like some physical object might ring and stop all this. I said nothing. I washed a mug and let the silence do the work that once belonged to my accusations. By noon, phones around town were whispering. I'd arranged, through a friend with legal access, for an anonymous notice to be sent to one of Laura's investors and to a reporter I trusted, not to sensationalize, but to make clarity inevitable. They would ask gentle, factual questions. Who signed? Who authorized? Where did the funds go? The kind of questions that generate documents. It was an odd moral machine I'd assembled. Reveal, allow the systems to do their work, and don't be the one to strike. It felt cleaner than shouting. It felt like handing someone a mirror and leaving the room. People see themselves in mirrors most honestly when they're alone. The first practical consequence arrived by mail, a polite but firm letter from the auditing firm engaged by one of Laura's investors. They asked for copies of invoices, proof of delivery, and evidence that the funds she'd reported as settlement had actually been spent on business expenses. Their tone had none of the heat of gossip. It was all teeth under civility. I watched Laura open that letter and saw the precise moment the ground shifted beneath her shoes. She called Graham. She stalked the house like a woman who'd lost a map to a familiar place. People that once nodded politely now asked questions with eyes that measured. A few friends stopped by bearing platitudes. They were careful with their footsteps. Renewed attention is like rain on a garden made of plaster. It exposes the hollow places quickly. When an investigator requested to meet with Laura's accountant, I did what I'd trained myself to do. I stayed out of the room and let the official processes make their tidy, sometimes ugly repairs. I had handed in copies of forgeries, bank statements, and emails to the audit team. Their job was to map those documents onto obligations. My part, I'd learned, was not to lean into vindictiveness, but to preserve the method of consequence. There were moments when I wondered if I'd been cruel simply by being quiet. Silence can sting as fiercely as words. The look on Laura's face in those days was not the mask of a villain in a novel. It was the small, private collapse of a person who had miscalculated the cost of their own designs. At times I felt sorrow for what she had become, for the version of herself that sharpened ambition into deceit. At other times I felt furnace relief, the kind that warms and scars in equal measure. The public reaction was not immediate drama. It was a creeping realignment. Contractors whom Laura had promised to pay began submitting paperwork to the auditors. One by one, vendors who had been left unpaid surfaced with invoices. The auditors' questions multiplied. The investor whose signature had propped the initial payments started calling in favors, calling in audits, calling in counsel. The pressure built like a low tide that eventually drains the shore, and then the most human part of it happened. Laura's charm, her ease with people, began to desert her. People that she'd once charmed, clients, casual acquaintances, even neighbors, began to ask practical questions and then step away. The social scaffolding that had propped her up, the polite network of trust she'd enjoyed for years, began to pull away like scaffolding lowered at the end of a job. Graham, predictably, dissolved from the picture. Men like him, who build mobility on other people's trust, are always the first to vanish when the lights flicker. He stopped answering texts. He changed numbers. He moved into a pattern of absence that was, in its way, the cleanest thing about him. One afternoon, a week after the auditors started calling, the local paper printed a short, factual story. No sensational headline. No shouty subtext about Vail and Callaway Holdings and their ongoing audit. The piece quoted the auditor, quoted payments and transfers missing supporting documentation, and concluded with the note that an investigation was ongoing. It read like a ledger, and for once the ledger read in public. The trustees on my policy contacted me a week later. They explained the mechanics in a voice like someone rolling up their sleeves. My amendments and trust structures had been validated. The trigger clause I'd inserted, the legal hook that rerouted the payout to charitable trusts if suspicious claims arose within 12 months, was enforceable. It required documentation and time, both of which the auditors were now verifying. In plain speech, if attempts were made to claim my life insurance in suspicious circumstances connected to recent changes, the payout would not go to Laura. It would be converted into a charitable fund in my name. The legal mechanism worked like a slow, mechanical jury. It applied no theater, no revenge porn. It simply redistributed expectation from greed to public good. The phrase, converted into a charitable fund, felt like iron mixed with gold when I first read it, a tidy alchemy of intention. At some point, Laura confronted me. She stood in the kitchen, coat half on, her voice a brittle edge. "What did you do?" she asked. There was a tear in her eye, not one born of sorrow, but of bewilderment. I could have shouted. I could have listed the evidence across the table, thrown her into the ring she had been building for years. Instead, I poured tea and sat opposite her, offering a calm face and a quieter truth. I protected the thing I promised to protect, I said. Not the money. The meaning, the part of our life that wasn't for sale. She laughed once without humor. "You're making yourself the hero of your own story," she said. "I'm making sure the story is accurate," I answered. That line seemed to unsettle her more than any raised voice would. There is a particular terror in having your version of yourself reflected back in documents you can't control. She'd tried to rewrite our narrative on the margins of signatures and transfers. The auditors were simply reading the original text aloud. From then on, her actions were smaller. The grandiose gestures faded into busy work. She tried to compose letters of apology that the auditors scanned and filed. She attempted to negotiate settlements. She appealed to friends for quiet calls. All those small acts were practical and human and, in another life, might have built toward something redemptive. The problem with those acts was that they came after the ledger had been opened and the public had seen how the money moved. Apologies made after accountability arrive in a different register. They are sometimes better received as confession than as plea. There was one decisive moment that wasn't decisive at all. An investor requested a meeting with both of us to discuss restitution. The meeting was clinical. Paper pushed across the table. Amounts discussed. A mediated schedule of payments sketched out that acknowledged vendor claims and set aside a small portion for legal fees. I signed what was needed. Laura did too. The document wasn't a celebration. It was a repair order. After the meeting, as we walked back to the car, one of the vendors, a man who had once cut my siding in our early house years, slapped my hand and said, "You did right by this place." He nodded toward the house and the garden, toward the community that had wavered and had been steadied. I felt an odd relief in that simple human gesture. There is a pragmatic poetry in restitution. Money, after all, is a tool. It can be used to build, or it can be used to bury. I'd chosen to turn the machine of the payout toward those who had been harmed. That choice felt less like victory, and more like returning a wronged balance to right. Months slid into a quieter arrangement. The trust mechanisms remained in place. Auditors archived their findings into firm files. Some funds were returned. A few broken relationships mended slowly through ordinary conversations and small efforts of accountability. Laura moved away from the public center of town. She took a job in a different industry, one that demanded less charm and more diligence. She wrote me once, thin words on a yellowed page, saying she was trying to do the work of repair. I read it and folded it away. My garden, the one we'd once nurtured together and which she had tried to turn into a stage for her plans, became a place of different labor. I dug out the ornamental edges she'd favored and planted hardy local perennials. I stopped tending to the idea that beauty must be a spectacle. Instead, I watered roots and watched slow things happen. Children in the neighborhood ran barefoot along paths that had once been manicured for show. Neighbors brought over excess seedlings. The fountain I'd once feared as a symbol of loss turned into a gentle center where people sat in the evening, talked softly, and let things settle. Often, at dusk, I'd walk the paths and think about what I'd learned. The thought that lingered wasn't triumph, it was stewardship. There is a dignity in tending what is left after a lie. It is not glamorous work. No one films the pruning of a rose bush for dramatic effect. Yet that pruning mattered. It mattered because a life is not a headline. It's a sequence of small acts shaped by character. People asked me more than once whether I regretted the way I handled things. Would I have done it differently? Would I have called the police, exposed the deceit on social media, delivered a monologue that would please strangers online? I shook my head. The loud theater of revenge is often satisfying for a minute, but it invites the same cyclical harm. I had chosen to convert a bad choice into a public accounting and then into something useful. That for many listeners reads like a paradox. How does one give a lesson without destroying? I told them then what I had told myself in the beginning. The lesson I wanted her to learn was not humiliation, but consequence. That consequences are not always designed to break. Sometimes they are designed to clarify. In the end, the trust paid out in the way I had arranged. The conditional elements held. The payouts went where the public record found them appropriate, and some funds were spent to right practical wrongs. The man-made mechanisms I'd put into place, lawyers, trusts, auditing, did not feel cold. They felt like instruments of civic repair. They turned a private betrayal into a public record and turned potential theft into restitution. Years later, when I look back at what happened, I don't picture her as a villain or myself as a hero. I see two people who wrestled with ambition, fear, and the small, cruel equations that can form when affection and finance mix. She learned something hard about choices made in secret. I learned something about the power of patience and the dignity of quiet repair. The garden remains. It's not the same as the one she designed. It's simpler and more honest. The plaque still carries the line she once suggested for trivia, in memory of what was and what could have been. I left it there. The letter softened by rain because erasing memory feels like erasing part of a life. I used what had been reclaimed to form a small foundation that funds neighborhood garden spaces for people rebuilding after loss. A final accounting, perhaps, that turns something selfish into something communal. If there is a moral you want at the end of the story, apart from the obvious cautionary lessons about trust and money, it is this: revenge does not require blood to be effective. It can be a rearrangement of truth enforced by law and guided by conscience. The real lesson is that clarity, transparent, deliberate, and patiently applied, often does a sharper job than fury. So if you ever find yourself staring at a document that looks too polished or a smile that seems practiced, don't act in haste. Measure, collect, document, and let the institutions you trust do their work. Use quiet craft and legal timing, not monuments of ruin. You'll find the world answers to accuracy more honestly than to noise. If you made it this far, and the story landed for you, do me a favor. Like the video. Drop a comment saying, "Measure twice," and subscribe if you want more stories where truth, slow, dull, and patient, does the heavy lifting. Because sometimes the best lessons are the quiet ones.